I was just talking to Eve backstage, and I was saying, I got the slot right after lunch, so I'm hoping everybody had some dessert with a little bit of sugar in them. I know I did, so I don't start falling asleep up here when I'm talking to you guys. Like Eve said, I'm Gabe Cura-Castro. I'm a staff engineer at Netflix, and I'm here to talk to you how to build federated workflows with your components. So if you were here yesterday for Bruce's chat with Matt, you know that Netflix is split into two sides of the company. Bruce works for consumer side, Netflix.com, streaming. I work on the studio side. But overall, as a company, we have an overarching goal, which is we aspire to entertain the world. We believe that stories move us, they make us feel more emotion, see new perspectives, and bring us closer together. So how do we do that? We want to not just be the largest streamer in the world, we want to be the largest studio in the world. Just this year, we're spending roughly $17 billion in content, and GraphQL is a key part of that strategy. Hopefully, some of you recognize some of this content. These are all things that have come out this year, and a lot of this was in part due to GraphQL. So within Studio, I work in content finance. Our team's responsible for the finance part of the content lifecycle. So Bruce mentioned, we like to say Netflix is a pitch-to-play company, right? From the moment that we get a script idea to the moment that you press play, we handle everything. And there's finance included in a chunk of this. So all of the little green areas are parts that my team's involved. There's more finance within the company. There's the corporate finance. We don't deal with that kind of stuff. But we start in forecast. Forecast heads into programming. We need to figure out, based on those forecasted budgets, what are we going to do? Which areas are we going to focus on? Creatives take a look at that, look through all the scripts we've gotten, and they start picking things. They make a deal. Once they sign a deal, we start shooting. Once all the shooting is done, we go into post-production, audio, video editing, VFX, all the kind of stuff that you can imagine we do. There's more finance there. Finally, we put it on Netflix.com, and on that month, we have to do all the accounting for it. We have to make sure all the talent's getting paid. We gotta make sure we pay royalties for all the music that we used. Gotta make sure that Kate Bush makes a little bit of money from Stranger Things. And we gotta make sure we close the books. So my team is responsible for all these areas, and we are split in three areas, mainly forecast, production, which includes post-production, and then accounting, which includes music, talent, residuals, and final book close. So let's go on a little bit of an adventure. To understand the problems that we were facing when we moved to the graph, we need to know where we started. And to really understand that, you need to understand one of the core tenets in Netflix, which is freedom and responsibility. This is the first thing that you hear when you join the company, and everybody goes, "What is that?" And the answer that you normally get from anybody is you have the freedom to do whatever you need to do to get your job done. This is great, lots of freedom. But you have the responsibility to do what's best for the company. And what usually happens when we join the company, we're like, yay, freedom. We have unlimited vacation. We can pick whatever technologies we want. We're going to do the things that we feel most comfortable with. It can get a little bit messy. So when we started looking at federating data, we were in a world of microservices with REST APIs. We were building these services in collaboration between the backend engineers and the UI engineers. But we were siloed, so the three sections of content finance did their own thing with their backend teams. They were trying to focus on what's best for their users, even though we're in a larger organization. There wasn't a common schema. We had common concepts. We were all talking about the same deals, the same titles, be it a movie or a show. We were talking about cost. At the end of the day, that's money, that's a specific currency. But we didn't use the same schemas. And we weren't necessarily always using the same definitions for things. So moving data between these services, which is what we need to do to get you that content that we all love, a little bit harder. There's a lot of mapping. We also end up with disjoint UIs, right? You can pick Ember, you can pick Angular, you can pick React, you can do whatever you want. You have the freedom to do what you want. We didn't have a design system because you just had the freedom to do what you wanted. So we ended up with a mix of frameworks. We had all of them. You can imagine. We have Ember apps that are still running today. We've gotten rid of our Angular apps, but we had them. We had a lot of React. So this doesn't scale very well, right? There's a lot of duplication if you're not using at least some sort of similar thing. But before we get to sharing, we need to agree on at least a few things. We're not going to force anybody to use anything, but we say, if you use these shared things, then you get to benefit from the cool stuff that we're building, that we're trying to make common. So we all kind of sat down and said, all right, we're all going to, for the most part, standardize on TypeScript and React for UIs. You can do whatever you want, but if you want our shared components, these are the things that we're going to use. And that maintains that core tenet, the spirit of that tenet, that you can do whatever you want, but you have the responsibility to do what's best for the company. And sometimes that means trying to agree on something. So, all right, we got to learn to share now. The first thing that we did about 4 years ago was we created our own design system called Hawkins. I think there's been a couple of presentations up on the stage over the years about it. Hopefully, you all love Stranger Things. We do, so that's why we named it Hawkins. So now we have a unified design system. Within content finance, we start looking at this and say, okay, well, we have a foundation here that we can start building some shared components. We all want to make sure that things like currency, exchange rates, and how we display money is consistent. So we started building some shared components, and everybody just contributes as they need to this thing. There's a lot of cross-team coordination going on, but it worked for a little while. We started moving to federated data that made things a lot easier, right? We didn't have to write as generic components. But what happens when we move UIs into a federated world? Great, we all have the data. Everybody can access everything. We have a massive federated graph. I think Bruce said on his end of things, 150-ish subgraphs. On the studio side, we are over 300 subgraphs in our federated graph. So there's a lot of data out there. We have Hawkins, our design system, and we can use all of the infrastructure to build shared workflows. Are we doing that? We're empowered to build great experience for our users, right? We don't have to think about what a button looks like, what a table looks like. We have all the data we want. Perfect, we can just go home, we're done. Well, there's some differences in there that we got to work out. What happens? Duplication starts creeping up, right? We have 3 siloed teams in here, all trying to solve somewhat similar problems. We have access to the same data, and we need to move fast. We all have competing priorities. The forecasting folks are trying to build the best forecasting systems for our forecasting accountants. Our production folks are trying to not only balance the needs of the external production companies, but the production accountants inside Netflix. And we want to move fast. We want to deliver value to our users as fast as possible. So we don't always have time, even though we notice something looks very similar to what they have. We need a little tweak. We can't just use their stuff. We end up with a bunch of duplicated work that doesn't get extracted. And we also noticed, because of these competing priorities, our designers weren't talking to each other as much and trying to coordinate on a shared design. We also noticed ownership problems growing, right? We have this shared pool of components that we're all contributing, but there is no specific owner. And when everybody owns it, nobody owns it, right? We are getting questions like, who owns the direction of this? Who is driving architecture? How do we prioritize this? And how do we prioritize against the goals of each one of these silos? And who's going to donate resources to build something that might benefit mostly the 2 other spaces? So our solution to this problem is federated components and building a federated design system. That starts with ownership, right? We assign an IC to be a captain driving direction. In case of content finance, that's my job. That person is responsible for publishing the plans for the next couple of quarters, making sure that we're listening to our users. In this case, my users are the engineers in the other silos. What do they need out of these components? And providing support, so they don't have to ask somebody else in another silo, hey, I know you wrote this component, can you fix it for me? They're busy, you're gonna have to wait. That's my job now. And we're gonna run this as a program. So essentially, we're creating a fourth silo within, a fourth space and not necessarily a silo within our org. The first thing that we did is to identify some common workflows. For anybody who is in some sort of finance, some of those are gonna look very similar. There's a lot of complexity in terms of content, but in finance, you're gonna do a lot of preparing data, reviewing, and approving. That's true if you're in forecasting, production, or accounting. We're gonna be comparing financials. That doesn't matter if you're in forecasting and you're comparing budgets, different versions of the budget over quarters, the budget over years. The folks in production finance are gonna wanna look at that budget as they start their production and say, how close are we staying to our budget, right? Still comparing very similar cost data. And at the end of the day, when it comes for the accountants to close the books on these titles, we're gonna gather the cost information from all of these other apps, put them together, compare them to the budget, and then compare them to our general ledger, which in our case is Workday. And we'll have to reconcile it all together, and then we have to tell the company what is the estimated final cost of this. There's gonna be some payments that happen 2 years after production is done. Right, so we wanna make sure that we're amortizing all the costs that occurred already and making sure that we have everything lined up to make those final payments. We have payments, right? Accounting is gonna do some of that. Talent and finance is definitely gonna do that. If we don't pay our actors, they're gonna go on strike. We gotta make sure we're paying the residuals correctly. Those are gonna change for writers, for example. We have to go make changes to that. At the end of the day, if we're calculating payments for residuals or for production, it doesn't matter. You're paying an invoice and sending money out from one account to some vendor account, right? So why are we building these systems separately? And more importantly, why were we displaying payment schedule information 4 different ways in the same team? And then we have a lot behind tracing and observability. If you're in finance, you might be under some compliance. Some of our apps are under SOX compliance. We need to be able to know when somebody changed a value, why they changed a value, who approved it, and why, right? And that happens across all our apps. So we did all of this in collaboration with UX because we need them as partners to make sure that they're designing a cohesive language for us to build. So what does actually start looking like? Well, Federated Design System is literally our design system Hawkins plus federated data. It is not part of Hawkins. We don't want to add complicated domain-specific knowledge to that design system. It should be generic, right? It is our version of Mature UI, for example. It is not a replacement for Hawkins. It needs to be domain-specific, not too broad, right? In our case, we're only focusing on content finance. And you might have some ideas, you'll see when we get to our examples, of things that start in our area, but are probably useful for the rest of Studio or for the rest of the company. And you can still shepherd that to a point and then expand your scope. And if we're doing that, we can be very opinionated, right? Hawkins cannot be too opinionated because it's generic. But if we're talking about cost and cost categories, how do we map a cost to a specific area? Is it internationalization? Is it subbing and dubbing? we can be very opinionated on how things are displayed, how things are interacted with. And most importantly, we want to make sure this is composable, right? Why is that? Well, if you're not allowing something to be composable and you're building a shared thing, everybody's going to keep giving you feedback and coming with ideas. And before you know it, you have a spaghetti monstrosity with 1,000 knobs that's very difficult to integrate into your application and difficult to understand. So how do we do that? We want to separate the concerns here and allow people to have a flexible solution. Generally, for each area, we produce 3 packages. One that includes our GraphQL. Most of it is fragments, right? We have a shared schema, we pull that out, we generate the fragments, and we use GraphQL CodeGen to get our TypeScript types. That's out as a package. Then we build a fetching layer generally. In some places, it's simply a wrapper around some of those GraphQL CodeGen hooks for our queries. And sometimes, if the workflow is complicated enough, we have a data management layer. So that's built on top of that first package. And then the third package builds on top of those first 2 to create components that instead of having generic props are mapped to our fragments. We very heavily lean on fragments. All the fragments that are specific mostly to content finance. And then we ship with 1 or 2 or 3 recipes that we feel like cover 80% of their use cases. This is how we avoid that spaghetti mess with all the knobs, right? If your use case doesn't fit those recipes, you're free to use the GraphQL layer, the data layer, pick all of the components that fit your need, and Lego your own UI together. If somebody has an idea of something that they think is shared and you're not quite sure about it, this is how you suggest them to use your components. They compose their own. And once you see it in practice and everybody else in your other spaces see you in practice and go, okay, well, I could see myself using that, then you bring that into your 80% recipe, and then they can convert. But if it's not something that everybody else thinks they can really use it, then it should probably stay over there, right? You don't want to overcomplicate your federated component. All right. What are some of examples of what we tackled? The very first thing that we built this way is something we call Netflix Graph Search. We have over 300 subgraphs. There's a hell of a lot of data, right? Some from completely opposite sides of the company that you want to bring in and you want to be able to search. You want to be able to display. So we had a backend team build an infrastructure on top of Elasticsearch that allows each one of these teams to define a domain-specific index that conforms to a schema. And then we built some UI components to allow you to search using Hawkins components into a federated component that gives you a unified searching experience across the entire company. So before this, everybody had all these different ways of searching and filtering and grouping things. Now, this is all we use. And if you want to create something that is a search experience within the company, this is what you go for. It takes a day, maybe 2. The hardest part is figuring out your index, and that's it. Right? The components are super easy to use. Within an hour, once your index is ready, you have this in production. Then at the same time, we started tackling commenting, right? When you're talking about finance, people from these different areas are going to have to talk to each other, and we want this conversation to be recorded for audit reasons, right? And at the same time, we started building something that we call Taskboard to manage our task workflows. That tackles that first common workflow that we identified, prepare, review, and approve. Guess what? Taskboard has commenting. Taskboard has searching. And it leverages these 2 other systems that everybody else is using. So what does it look like? If you read all this data, some of it is going to look like garble. It is. I can't show you actual names of things, but this is what the UI, the next version of this UI looks like. If you look at the very top, on the left side, we have that navigation that comes built into Taskboard. Those stop sections are common to everybody. The one highlighted in that section, this is where we allow each application to save some groupings and filterings that make sense for that specific context. Now, can you imagine for all the places where we have tasks, and some of the apps have separate task boards for different workflows, and if we had to build in knobs for all of these, people would have to have a search within the nav bar to find their filter, right? We don't want to do that. So we want to allow people to have their flexibility to build what they want and what they need for their users. Same thing happens when you look at the main content of this view. That's what Netflix Graph Search looks like. That's what it looks like across every single app that we have in the company that's using that infrastructure, right? But in here, these folks were able to feed their index and say, these are the facets I want to be able to allow my users to filter and group by. And these are the columns I want to be shown in my table. They don't have to manage the search. They don't have to manage the table. All they have to do is say, these things need to be there. This is the data, done. When you open a task, you still see that same navigation, but here's where things starts getting customized. At the top, we have an area that we call a test header that you can add your own content, but there are things that are going to be common. You're going to have at least a preparer or a reviewer, depending on the workflow of your task. Assigning that to somebody should look the same every time, right? We're just looking for a user. So that comes built in. You don't need to use it in that exact spot, right? If you want your view to look different, you can pull all these components and move them around in your own view. And that middle section is very specific to this use case, which is a payment schedule, right? It's a payment schedule for talent finance. The payment schedule for accounting might be different. And that area is completely customizable. You see at the bottom, we have commenting. We have history. That's common for everybody. You want to see the states that this thing went through. Might have been approved twice. Who approved it the first time? Who rejected? All common. So what does it look like in code? In the back end, a task is called a work process. This is the basic task fragment. It includes assignee fields, which is the basic assignee field, which builds onto a shared user fragment that we use across our space. And then you can also see this is what the TypeScript type looks like. We take that to query, very simple query, leverages those fragments, leverages some fragments that are shared across the company for gateway information. Gateway is our name for our router. And what it looks like once it's generated by GraphQL CodeGen. So like I said, in here, you can use just those two things and customize your own view if you want. We found that most users haven't needed it yet. But we're going to get to a point where we do, and we don't want to complicate this view. This is enough for our users 80% of the time. So what do we get? Now we actually have shared complex workflows built on top of shared data, and we're not duplicating our work. Right? When a PM comes over and says, hey, that commenting thing they enabled over there, can we have that in our task board? Yeah, right? It's built in. So we get faster time to delivery. We get actual useful things to our users without having to do it 2, 3, 4 times like we did for payment schedules. And now there's a clear ownership and a roadmap that people can rely on for these components. Instead of, well, I hope Vince can help me next week, and then he's busy. Future work, we're going to start tackling some of these other common workflows that we talked about. Comparing financial data, payment details, change history visualization, and activity logs. So we went from having the freedom to do whatever we wanted, but ending up with a disjoint UI. We started sharing our data when we went to a federated system, but our UIs didn't improve that much. We still had duplication. And now we're starting to tackle these things with the federated data in mind. And we're hoping this is going to help us reduce duplication within each one of these spaces, and we're hoping the rest of the company starts adopting these ideas in their own spaces. Love to hear what you're doing to solve this problem. Any ideas or feedback you have about what we're trying to do. And if you have any feedback about my talk, please do share it. If you have more, feel free to contact me. My email is Cura-Castro@netflix.com. I'm not on X anymore, but you can find me on Mastodon. And if you just want to chat over the next couple hours before we're done, just pull me aside and we'll have a chat. Thank you.